Good afternoon, everyone. This is Adashima Oyo, the Director of HASTAC Scholars. I would like to welcome everyone to Digital Fridays. Today's topic is critical digital pedagogy, and our host today is Grace. So I'm going to read Grace's bio, and then I'm going to turn it over to Grace, who is going to facilitate this Digital Friday. So Grace is a project manager, learning experience designer, and doctoral candidate in English at NYU. Her dissertation investigates contemporary multi-ethnic literature as a site for theorizing justice-oriented digital interface design, especially in the context of educational technology. She also manages curriculum design and community engagement at Technicio, a Brooklyn-based ed tech company specializing in STEAM learning products that teach circuitry, programming, and systems design alongside creativity and critical thinking. So we will allow some time for questions throughout this Digital Fridays. You can also raise your questions at the end. You may raise your questions by typing it inside the chat box. If you have a very long question or comment, we're happy to unmute you. So with that, Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you so much. You can hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So thank you so much for hosting this, and it ended up being more timely than maybe I would have liked. But I'm excited to go into some of these strategies with all of you and hopefully hear about your experiences, both in general and also this past week, as I know there's been a lot of unanticipated labor. So this is critical digital pedagogy, humanities approaches. I'm going to, here we go. Let me move some of this stuff out of the way. So just a brief overview. We're going to start with intros and workshop learning goals. And I would, again, love to hear from all of you throughout. Please use the chat function. I'm also monitoring it. And so if you have questions or want to share an experience, I think that would be really nice if you would share it. Then we'll go into kind of the bulk of the presentation, which is about methods for critical digital pedagogy. And I'm going to outline 3 strategies in particular. They're not exhaustive, but I think these are useful ones to get started. Specifically historiography, auto-ethnography, and entity relationship exploration. And obviously I'll get more into what those mean. And then finally, just some resources at the end. And I know there are some upcoming events and documents that have been circulating around Twitter that I think are really good resources right now. So I'm going to link you all to those as well. So let us start with intros. So thank you, Adashima, for that introduction. Like you said, I am doing my PhD at NYU in literature, but my day job is in curricular design. And digital learning design, and specifically I work with STEAM, which is a little bit misleading, but really I work on the Internet of Things and teaching kind of networked systems to K-12 predominantly students, and really I try to bring a humanities skill set to that specific question. And so that's sort of what we're going to be talking about too, is how do we get rid of this kind of false dichotomy of STEM and the humanities, and think about how those are very much part of the same kind of epistemological question. So I would love if you are comfortable introducing yourselves in the chat. I'd love to get a sense of who's out there and where you're joining us from, and any other information that you're open to sharing. Please do. Hopefully someone chimes in. And especially given the circumstances, if you are going to be, or if you were teaching this semester and you've been kind of transitioned, so to speak, to online learning, I would love to hear about whether that's the case, whether you were already teaching online, and kind of what the circumstances or platform that you're going to be using. I think it would be really interesting to see how many of us have ended up facilitating online courses unexpectedly. So just a few workshop learning goals. I like to outline them because I'm a learning designer. So the first, let me move this so I can actually see. Thinking critically about the specific affordances of the humanities for digital pedagogy, because I think we don't often think of humanities training as training for technology, but it very much is. And so really foregrounding that, I think, is really potentially useful and generative. I'm going to introduce 3 strategies for critical digital pedagogy, as I've already outlined. We're going to think about the applications of these strategies for our current moment, and this kind of like urgent moment of transitioning our courses, and how we can make them more critical in a way that's maybe not so resource intensive, because obviously we're not necessarily equipped to do a lot of scaffolding in this situation. And then finally share some resources and hopefully collect resources from you that you'd like to share with the group, because I think there's a lot of really good stuff that's being made available right now. Chat. Looks like we have a pretty wide range of folks chiming in here. So definitely keep your eye on the chat. Okay, so first I do want to flag Jacqueline Renamont, who is our own wonderful HASTAC scholar, or she runs the HASTAC instance up at Dartmouth and is really involved in thinking about digital pedagogy and critical higher education, and also like kind of anti-racist and feminist approaches to data more broadly and information. An incredible scholar whose work is very much influential in my own work. And so she recently posted on the HASTAC website some thoughts about teaching online in our current kind of crisis situation. And she says, it is useful to talk to your students about the new expectations, including making room for insufficient technical infrastructure, anxiety and illness in students and family. And so really, I think it's important for us to remember that this isn't online teaching or online learning. It's disaster response, and rather than trying to suddenly think about how to produce really critically rich online learning, it's more important to do what you can and be transparent with your students. And that, to me, I think is a big piece of where the humanities come in, is how do we be transparent with our students, think about the disruption critically with them, and also make our own struggle with it visible, and all of the ways in which the technology facilitates or occludes certain things. So that's part of, I think, what we're going to be talking about today, is really like the mediation. There's a lot of mediation happening, and rather than kind of trying to make it invisible in the background and make things seamless or easy, actually thinking about the friction and thinking about the lack of resources and the contingency of the experience is really important to the critical pedagogy part of it. So thinking about that, the description of this webinar is frames the content in this perceived separation of STEM and the humanities, which I think a lot of us have experience with. Those of us who have taught gen eds or teach composition maybe probably see it in our students, where they either are expressing concerns because they don't feel like they are equipped to be writers or readers, or they maybe sometimes are often disgruntled, like that they have to take literature courses when they want to be engineers and they want to be pre-med. And so I think that fraughtness is built in very much to our disciplinary landscape. And it's deeply ingrained in a way that makes it so that we often reproduce it ourselves. This is a quote from Allison Booth and Miriam Posner's article in PMLA earlier this year. And they had been reflecting a bit on the DH Digital Humanities minor over at UCLA. And part of what they say is that Miriam Posner was surprised to see kind of the disciplinary makeup of the students who enrolled in that minor, because rather than literature and history and art historians, she got cognitive scientists and sociologists and statisticians in terms of major. And I think that this idea of the instead is really pivotal to thinking about the rhetoric in how we relate the humanities to STEM education. And so the argument here, I think, inherent to this webinar and also to their article, is that you can't extricate the humanities from the praxis of the scientific or the technical. They're very much intertwined, and it's more about how do we make that relationship very visible to our students despite all of the disciplinary boundaries in the institution that they have to engage with every day. And so I think we see that too reflected in the lack of technology integration. I'm a graduate student. No one ever really trained me in digital pedagogy or technology in any meaningful way, even though, you know, I work with it all the time. I think a lot of humanists and faculty even have a disdain for technology in the classroom. I see lots of technology bans in the classroom. Or I'll hear things like, you know, I don't do computers, or I don't know how computers work. And that's partly a lie, because I think everyone works with computers all the time. And to say that your own work is not reliant on or engaged with computing, I think is a little disingenuous. But I also think that people are intimidated by technology, and we don't really equip them to realize that actually they have the skill set to think critically and productively about technology. We train students for lives in technology. That's really, I think, at the heart of humanities education. And so again, like really making that visible and explicit. So I've outlined 3 models here. They're some of many. I'm sure you all have other amazing models that you use and examples to cite, and I hope you'll continue to share them in the chat and in general. So I often teach versions of this workshop in the context of data and introducing data and information structures to humanities students. I'm not doing that here. I'm trying to broaden it and make it accessible, especially given how many of us are now on Zoom. But ultimately, these are methods about thinking critically about how technology and kind of taxonomies and ontologies mediate how we know and how we can come to know. So just very quickly, since I used the word taxonomy and ontology, all I really mean by that, an ontology is the way that pieces of information can relate to each other. So for example, I have 2 not very nice diagrams, but the first one kind of shows you, okay, here are different kinds of data or types of information, and these are all of the way that they engage with one another. So you can see that the arrows are, you know, like this thing produces this thing, or this thing consumes this thing. So an ontology is basically all of the things that relate data in a system. So that's what I mean by an ontology. A taxonomy is a similar kind of thing. It's just a little bit more hierarchical. So you can see to the right, you know, these are types of motor vehicles. And these are the kinds of structures that really confine everything we come to know. And the more prevalent a particular kind of structure is, as we'll see, you know, the more we are inclined to use that structure, and that bounds what's possible in terms of the questions we can ask of our information. So I'm gonna, on that note, start with a modality that I think we use a lot, whether we realize it or not. And that is the table, just, you know, for a starting point to think about digital technology. I'm sure we encounter tables every day. In the chat, if you could maybe tell me some places where tables figure into your life, whether it's your research or just like your workflows, in your teaching, whether they're explicit or implicit. I would love to hear some like ideas about where you see tabular styled data in your lives. Oh, wait and see if any of you respond. Okay, cool. So attendance, grade books, exactly, definitely. Content analysis, so results. If you're doing research, you may organize your results in a tabular spreadsheet. Workflows with a team. Certainly as a project manager, I use a lot of tables and a lot of software that models data this way. Okay, so those are some good examples. Yeah, research data analysis, rosters, you know, in the pedagogical context, I think we see it all the time. Like you said, grade books, budgets, yes, definitely. Film and research budgets, yes. So there's a lot of information that we interact with in this format all the time. Hiring, yeah, people management, and that's actually really an excellent point. Attendance, rosters, people management, all kind of forms of how we keep track of people in places, which we're going to turn to in a moment. And so, yeah, tabular data is everywhere. Even think about what your email looks like. And that's because it's useful. You know, I think a lot of things in LMSs are organized this way. A lot of our communications are organized this way. And it's a sensible, regularized way of organizing information. It's very consistent. And that's important because it makes it both very machine readable and also very human readable. But this is a technology that there's a lot of opportunity to interrogate from various perspectives. And here we're going to think about what a historiographic approach might be to tabular kind of information structures. So I'll come back to Jackie Wernemont, whose work is amazing. And so she wrote a book called Numbered Lives. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And this is really kind of historiographic media archaeological approach to things like tabular data. And part of the work she does is, you know, this kind of historical research on things like body counts and mortality and how people are being enumerated in this format, right? And so if we think about the table as both a practice of bookkeeping and mercantilism, how we keep track of things that we buy and sell, but also a technology of recording people, and especially as they relate to place, right? If we think about the upcoming census, this is very much this kind of tradition. And so a historiographic approach really takes all of this into account and asks students to confront the information that they work with or the technology that they're engaging with, and how does the information structure behind it come out of a particular epistemological tradition. And so I'll give you a case study. I taught a course last year where we read this book, Behold the Dreamers. Some of you may be familiar with it. I'm not going to suggest it's an amazing book, but I think it was really useful for having this kind of conversation. And so this text is, if you are not familiar with it, it is about a family that immigrates to New York City from Cameroon, and the kind of head of the family goes to work for a Lehman Brothers executive as a chauffeur. And this is something that my students were asked to think about. Where are the information structures at play in this text, and what kind of information structures? And tabulation was a big one for a number of reasons. But one way to really think about this in a historical modality that's not actually specific to one historical period is to look at how tabular data is working in this novel and how it comes out of a legacy of information. So here, this is just a kind of financial table, but something that happens in the text is we see the fallout after the financial crash in 2008, and specifically the fall of Lehman Brothers, because the main employer in the book is an executive there at Lehman Brothers. And I don't know if any of you knows about Lehman Brothers necessarily, but part of the reason that they failed was because of something called Repo 109. And Repo 109 is an accounting practice where you can make it look like you have more liquid assets than maybe you really do, because you are classifying things that are really short-term loans as sales. So this is a process of classification of storage and where you store your information, and how the tables that you store that information speak to each other, where they are connected and where they are not. And so it enables you to be disingenuous in a way that at the end of the fiscal year, it looks like you have a lot, perhaps more assets than you do, even though you're going to be receive the short-term loans are actually going to be turning around much faster, and it's not actually sales money. And so this is a kind of tabular data and a way to instrumentalize it to change really global financial markets. And it has a long history. And so we decided to think about what this looks like from a historical perspective. And I went into the archives, and this is a county register out of Alabama, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Alabama. And this is from the year 1850. And if we look at the structure of it, it's very similar, right? We have lines of data, we have maybe some subsections in various categories. And we can think about, what is important in this data we have, it's a register of slave inhabitants in Montgomery. What kind of data is being represented? I don't know how well you can see. It's actually names of slave owners. So this is documenting sales of slaves in Montgomery in 1850. And you have information about the number of slaves, their age, their sex, nothing about their names, not surprisingly necessarily. But something that I asked my students to notice is that, in fact, one of the individuals in this ledger is Henry Lehman. Henry Lehman was one of the founders of the New York Cotton Exchange and made quite a lot of money at the start in the slave trade. And this is eventually what became what we knew as Lehman Brothers in the 2000s. And so the technology has a history that is relevant to the way that it's executed. And this is very much a kind of historiographic approach, is asking your students to interrogate those kinds of information connections where it's not really necessarily about periodization, and it's not necessarily about geography, although that's obviously relevant here, but it's about where are the adjacencies in the way that the information is structured or presented. And this is kind of this was really a shocking moment for my students, because they had never thought about the way that tabulation has become instrumentalized by colonialism, by racism, other kind of technologies of oppression, but very much all of our everyday interactions with technology are informed by that legacy. So what good does this do us in our current kind of crisis moment of everyone being on Zoom? I think there are a lot of ways to do this in a kind of accessible way. Obviously, this kind of historiographic work is hugely labor intensive, and going to the archives or even doing archival research online is not something that we have the time necessarily to do. I couldn't even do it here. I would have liked to spend more time looking into kind of the history of these kinds of technologies like Zoom, but alas, I was setting up Zoom workflows. But here's a chart. This is the stock market. This is the price of stock for Zoom actually over the past week, and perhaps one of the only stocks that's doing relatively well overall. But this is one kind of, what are the conditions of possibility, and what are the kind of socio-historical and economic conditions that are making our this technology viable and increasingly prevalent. That's one kind of historiographic approach. If you are going to be online with your students, you can help them think about it that way. But another way to do it that is perhaps even easier is, what does the interface allow? And here I've highlighted something that's in the bottom bar of my Zoom window right now. If you've ever hosted a Zoom meeting, you've probably noticed this. It says manage participants. And so something that you can do with your students is actually think about the rhetoric around participant management, around people management. You've said some of the examples you gave around tabular data, hiring and attendance and rosters, and all of this kind of dates back to the kind of historical context that Jackie Werneman talks about in her book. And so what would it look like if, when you onboard students, you have them confront that kind of logic of management of human bodies and the kind of abstractions of human bodies. So that's certainly one method that's a humanities informed method in this technological space that I think could be useful if you're thinking about it from a critical perspective. And if you have ideas about how you might implement that in your courses, or if you have other kind of bits, I don't know what technologies you're using, if you have other suggestions for folks, please do share them in the chat. I think that this is definitely a way to make visible the epistemological and critical implications of what we're doing right now. And while you do that, hopefully you will share something in the chat, but we can look at this kind of second category of strategy that I wanted to share, which is auto-ethnography. And so first I'll give you my auto-ethnography. A couple of years ago, I was taking a course over at DHSI with Dorothy Kim, and it was a course on race and digital humanities. Let me respond. Yes, please, if you have ideas about like what parts of the technologies that you're using in your online classes, if you are now teaching online, that could be a space to have a historiographic or a media archaeological conversation. You can think about that and share it later, or you can share it now. I think that that could be just useful to, if you have some immediate thoughts about, oh, this is a way I could implement historiography. That would be awesome. Yes. So yeah, so back to auto-ethnography. I was at the time working on building out a software platform for humanities data management. And a lot of what we were using were these kind of off-the-shelf libraries, things like mapping technologies, like geospatial mapping technologies. We were using a graph database and lots of APIs to get information. And we weren't necessarily doing the job of documenting or interrogating them. And so I started to think a lot about, what is a form of documentation when we write software that's not just a privacy policy or terms of conditions, but also a kind of epistemological or autoethnographic approach to documentation. And I've been thinking about that ever since. And I'm sure some of you think about this when you deal with technology or produce digital artifacts. And so what does that look like in the classroom potentially? I'm going to just touch on quickly 3 categories of autoethnography that I think are potential ways to model this in the classroom. The first 2, I will use this project as an example. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. It's called Torn Apart Separados, and it was a multifaceted series of visualizations using various kinds of data related to ICE and crises of migration in the US. And this was a project that was built by an amazing team, including Alex Gill, Rupika Risam, Manan Ahmed, Myra Alvarez, Mosir de Sa Pereira, who was formerly my colleague, Marisa Martinez, Silvia Fernandez, Linda Rodriguez, and a bunch of other contributors who did a really amazing job thinking not just about data visualization, but also about the documentation that surrounded the data visualization. And so here are some examples. This is sort of the first kind of autoethnography that I'll flag, which is really about data processing. And so this is written by Moasir, who did a lot of the data, they all did. But here he's talking about data collection and cleaning and how that turned into the front end of this website. And there's a lot of talk about kind of the technical challenges, but also the processes. So if we think about this from a systematic approach, there's a kind of autoethnography where you are talking about everything you've done to your data or everything that you do when you interact with a technology in a way that makes it both reproducible, but also makes very apparent the decisions that you have made. Because teaching an online class, for example, involves thousands of active decisions on your part or on my part as an educator, but maybe I'm only documenting a small percentage of that, when actually it's really important to the pedagogy to understand all of the decisions that go into that. If I'm regularizing data and I'm changing misspellings, I'm losing something. And so that's one kind of autoethnography that you can employ in the classroom, asking students with all of their engagements with technology and information to record what they do with it. And this really takes into account, this is a quote from Johanna Drucker, that all data are capta. They're taken, they come out of a kind of contingent, particular context, and they're not inherent in the world. They're always constructed. And so we need to pay heed to that construction by giving a voice to it very explicitly, rather than assuming that it's obvious or unimportant. So the second kind of autoethnography that I just wanted to touch on is more of an affective variety. So this is actually from Alex's reflection on this project. And it really thinks about, the relationships with family and the personal context into which this project fits. And something I really would urge people to do or think about is, what are assignments or assessments that privilege this form of autoethnography? Rather than asking a student to write a research paper, what would it be like to ask them to think about their personal relationship to the research topic that is of interest to them, and how did they kind of arrive at that? Because there's a narrative around that, and I think it's really important because it both asks us to think about the affective labor that goes into our work, and it also asks us to confront any potential biases that are at play there when we approach the research or teaching or whatever else that we do. And it's part of an academic kind of labor that's deeply undervalued. And I think that modeling that for students is sometimes very liberating for them. Finally, a third mini category here of autoethnography, which is really about friction and confusion and difficulty from predominantly a technical perspective, but also a more conceptual one. And so this is my autoethnography here of this slide deck. I was looking at templates yesterday, specifically for Google Slides. I thought that would be a good way to go about this. And one of the options that came up on the slide I was on is coronavirus disease. This is a slide template, and they have a section on medical slide templates. And so they knew that there would be a lot of decks being produced around COVID in institutions. And so they built out a deck that specifically had this name. And so this was a kind of moment of friction for me where I really had to think about the technology I was using, where did it come from? And I didn't have nearly enough time going back to this idea of historiography to think about, what even is the history of this medium, but how it's instrumentalized, how it's standardized, really taking away a lot of the contingency and specificity of it. And I ended up abandoning Google Slides, but this is a moment for me where documenting that experience is actually really generative, because it raises all of these epistemological and ontological questions that are very humanities driven, but have a very kind of technical outcome for me. And I think this is, especially in our moment right now, going to be true a lot. I had a student who was working with a Zoom workflow I had set up earlier, and she said, I'm having connection problems. I've tried troubleshooting. I can't figure it out. Yesterday I was at work and I could not save to Google Drive. It was just not working. This document that Jackie Wernemann has shared and that's been circulating around Twitter about resources for educators also has limited functionality because there's so much volume of traffic going to it. So this is a kind of opportunity to raise questions about functionality, about accessibility, things like minimal computing. If a student is experiencing friction in their process of working with technology, asking them to think, why is that? Where are those points of friction? And what do they show me about kind of systems evaluation and knowledge? And then also, in those moments that are seamless, what does that tell me about systems evaluation and knowledge? What does it mean that I'm having a lot of trouble with this document that's, using a free resource and is being widely shared, or an open source technology, but Apple Pay is always seamless, or biometric entry makes things more seamless? What kind of collection practices are behind that? And that's a moment for them to reflect and really use their own interaction with the technology, whether it's a learning technology or anything in their daily lives, as a case study in something kind of more conceptual. So those are more or less the three categories of autoethnography. Again, if you have any ideas that you'd like to share based on that type of modality, I would love to hear it in the chat, or think about it and share later at the end. This last section, which is the third kind of humanities strategy that I'd like to share, is pretty short. It's really designed more for a class where you're introducing information modeling and data directly into the classroom, but I think it's useful in general, and we don't do enough of it in the humanities. So entity relationship exploration. I don't know if any of you has ever seen an ER diagram, but entity relationship diagrams, speaking of auto-ethnography, I am trapped at home with my partner who is also working from home with his sister whose university was canceled. So there's lots of contingency happening with things falling. But yeah, so auto-ethnography, ER diagrams are basically a way you would map out a database. It's a way to think of all of the data points that are going to be in that database and how they relate to each other. This is an example of a kind of traditional relational database where you have maybe like shops or bank branches. You have all the sellers, all the transactions, all the branches, customers, and they all relate to each other, where you can store that data independently and then link it. So that's a kind of traditional way in tabular data to do it. And so one methodology that I really advocate for in the classroom is what if we think about the relationships differently. You know, I think humanists really like to go to tabular spreadsheets, especially if we're digitizing historical data. It's very easy to reproduce the original structure, which is often a table. But what if we kind of tore apart that structure and thought, okay, what are other ways I can relate this data to one another? What if it's actually about, you know, like colors or affects instead of names or dates? What are other kinds of data categories that we can use as points of intersection? And what if we modeled as networks or as irregular data structures, or even as plain text, where we just dump a bunch of stuff into one document instead of trying to organize it? What becomes possible when we organize our data that way, because tabular data is going to facilitate certain kinds of questions that we can ask of it, but obviously there are other kinds of questions we can ask. And so it can be a fun activity for students just to think about, you know, if you had to model this data in a way that didn't involve kind of regularization, what would it look like? What are like some weird points of interest that you would collect your data across? Or what kind of network can you imagine, or other kinds of ruptures in the normality of the data organization? Yeah, so definitely encouraging students to think about schema and to backwards engineer the data that they work with or the technologies that they work with can be really illuminating to demonstrate that choices were made and things were occluded, and things are always occluded when you enforce a certain kind of structure, and certain things are opened up. So that I think is really a useful strategy. So I'm going to stop there in terms of content. So we have about 20 minutes if folks want to talk and share their experiences. I've just flagged some things that I think are useful right now if you have been pivoted, so to speak, to online. And I'm going to share these links live in chat. So the first one is I saw that there's going to be a special edition Digital Fridays on a Tuesday for remote instruction. And here is hopefully that link. Let's see if this works. Oh, nope, sorry, HASTAC team. I meant to send that to everyone. The second is the blog post I've been citing from Jackie Wernemont, and there's also a link there to a document, but I will send you the link as well. Here is this. And then here is the document. This is an open document where folks have been sharing resources that they have. There are all kinds of, I mean, people have been laboring over online learning for a long time and doing really incredible work. And so this is an amazing opportunity too, to just learn from them. But yes, if you have questions or comments, please share it in the chat. We can also turn things over to you if you would like to speak about your experience. I would love to hear from some of you if you have ideas about anything that I've said. The other thing that I'll flag is the hashtag on Twitter, COVID Campus. which I will just send you as a hashtag. That's been started by Hannah Albert Abrams, and people have been kind of rallying around this hashtag as a source of information as well. And there have been some really incredible documents of, you know, faculty trying to help out if students are displaced, or if folks need kind of financial or housing or food resources. There are lots of people out there trying to rally a community. So please check that out. Anyone have any questions or comments or things they'd like to share? Also, if anyone needs any kind of help or input about going online, I'm more than happy. You're always welcome to reach out to me. Here, I will. This is my email address. Yes, definitely don't hesitate to get in touch if there's anything that I can help with. I know it can be intimidating to suddenly need to be online. Yeah, so I'll be around and wait in a few minutes if anyone has questions. But otherwise, I hope you all stay safe and healthy and practice social distancing to the extent that it's possible. I realize it's not always possible, and lots of people are at risk of losing their livelihoods. So.
Hi, Grace. I'm just going to jump in real quick. So while you're thinking about any questions or comments, I want to make a plug for our 2 Digital Fridays that are coming up. We have a special edition Digital Friday happening on Tuesday, and we have another one happening on Friday. So I will be sending out invites for both of those Digital Fridays. We welcome you to participate, to join. These are very timely Digital Friday topics given what's going on right now. So the one on March 20th is online teaching and collaborative reading. That's going to be on Friday, March 20th from 12 to 1. And then our other Digital Friday, the special edition one happening this Tuesday, is remote instruction and online class engagement. So I welcome you to participate in both of those Digital Fridays.
I sure can, and I will also type it in. But that was Jacqueline Wernemont's Numbered Lives, and and it's an excellent book, and I encourage all of you to get it. Do I have it somewhere? It's somewhere in one of these stacks, but it's amazing, and it's really goes over, it's really about things like body counts and other technologies of tracking information about humans. And so I think it's relevant, yes. And Behold the Dreamers, as Alex just pointed out, so that's a novel, that's the novel I was referencing that I read with my students. Yes, HASTAC did do a collaborative book discussion for Jackie's book. So you should check that out for sure. Well, in any case, thank you all for showing up. I know things have been hectic, so I appreciate your coming.
Thank you, Grace, so much for this Digital Friday. This Digital Friday has been recorded, so if you want to watch it at a later time, that's also fine. And hopefully Grace will also be drafting up a recap for us when she has an opportunity, so we will also share that on the HASTAC website as well.
Yep.
So if there are no other questions or comments, I thank you all for participating. Please stay safe. Please try not to panic too much. And, you know, good luck with everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.